Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Joshua Tucker. I'm the director of the Jordan Center and a professor of politics here at NYU. We really want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day today at this late point in June during the summer. We don't normally hold events during the summer here at the Jordan Center, but this event was such a dramatic development, and Anastasia Vlasenko, who's a postdoc here at the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia for 2022-2023, as well as for next year, who will be returning for next year for 2023-2024, felt it was really important to try to get people together to talk about the implications of what had just happened. So we're really grateful to our panelists who'll be joining us here today, who Anastasia will be introducing in a moment, but to all of you for joining us as well. And for those of you who couldn't make it today but are watching the recording of this, we thank you as well for your time. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Anastasia, who will be moderating today's discussion. So Anastasia, thank you so much for taking the effort to put this panel together at such short notice and for getting us such a distinguished set of panelists to be joining us here today. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Josh. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today virtually at NYU Jordan Center. And today, as you probably know, we're going to discuss the consequences of the Kakhovka Dam explosion. So the way it is going to work today is that we're going to allow each of our panelists to have opening remarks of about 10 to 15 minutes or so. We'll be introducing each panelist in turn before they go. And I will make sure that we also put their biographies in chat so that you can see them there as well. After that, we will have more of a discussion. First, our panelists will respond to the questions from the audience. And if you would like to ask a question, please let us know in the chat down below, or just raise your hand in Zoom. If you're using the chat function, you're not interrupting the speakers as they're talking, so you can leave questions at any time that you like. It's really convenient. I would also like to thank the Jordan Center, our amazing director, Joshua Tucker, and our program administrator, Alexander Spitalnik, for organizing this time-sensitive event in the middle of the summer semester when we normally do not have anything really happening in terms of events. And I want to thank all of you today for joining us. We are scheduled to go for an hour and a half, and we will finish by 1:30 p.m. Eastern. Thank you everyone who is joining us today from all sorts of different locations. And thank you everyone who is watching us online. So it is a great pleasure to have our panelists here today. Today's panel is going to be on the Kakhovka Dam destruction and its consequences for the Ukrainian ecosystem and residents. I want to note that we ask our panelists to think broadly about this specific event and the impact of war on the environment in Ukraine and neighboring countries in general. I encourage the audience to think broadly as well, and when we will have our discussion section of the panel. We tend to think about the impact of war on the balance of power in the world, NATO expansion, contestation between authoritarian and democratic regimes. But what about the impact of war on environment, people who are tightly linked to this environment, and the ability of a state to engage in rescue efforts on the front lines, essentially in the combat area? So to just give you a refresher, for everyone who has been struggling with following this overwhelming and extremely traumatizing news, on June 6th, an explosion caused significant damage to the central section of the Kakhovka Dam, resulting in uncontrolled water flow downstream the Kakhovka Reservoir. The destruction of the dam led to tens of thousands of people being in a flood zone. Over 40 different towns and villages in Ukraine are severely flooded, and massive amounts of livestock died. At the moment, it is estimated that at least 5 years and $1 billion are required to rebuild the Kakhovka Dam. 4 channels have been identified as drying up, which will affect the drinking water of some 700,000 people. As of now, the Kakhovka Reservoir is turning into a desert, and I highly encourage everyone to spend some time on YouTube to actually see what the damage looks like almost a month after the event. So that's what we asked our panelists to talk about from the environmental, historical, and societal perspective. I have a ton of questions to ask, but before that, we will start with Maria Faticov, a postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of Sciences of Université de Sherbrooke in the province of Quebec, Canada. Maria is an ecologist who is largely interested in the process structuring microbial communities associated with plants and animals. Currently, Maria explores the complex interactions between the tree microbiome, the air microbiome, and human health in the urban environment. Maria received her PhD at the Department of Ecology, Environment, and Plant Sciences at Stockholm University in 2021. She obtained her Master of Science from the Department of Biology at Helsinki University in 2015 and BA in Ecology, Environmental Protection, and Sustainable Development from the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in 2012. During her academic journey, Maria actively participated in several environmental NGOs, including Finnish Association for Nature Conservation. In these roles, she focused on gathering information on endangered plant and fungal species while advocating for the establishment of new protected areas. With a firm belief in promoting a more equitable and tolerant world, Maria places great importance on the conservation of nature. Maria will kick things off with the discussion of the environmental impact of the Kakhovka Dam explosion and what it means for the Ukrainian ecosystem. So, Maria, I'll turn the floor over to you. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Nastya, for such a great introduction. I'll share my presentation in a moment. Oh, I hope you can see my slides. Not, please. Yes, it's actually, I'm flattered that we are starting our discussion today with the topic of the environment. Because often it's the last topic on the table for the discussion. So yeah, I'm Maria Faticov and I'm postdoctoral fellow in ecology. In the past 10 years, I have been researching a lot on doing a lot of research on tiny microorganisms, microscopic organisms in the environment, those that are microorganisms that are living on the trees, in the soil, in the urban air, and also a part of our human body. But I also very much interested in the impacts of climate change and especially climate warming on those microbial communities, but on their interaction between microbes and any other organism in the environment. I wonder how the climate change will affect those interactions and disturb the environment. As of recently, there is other topics that I'm also concerned about is actually about the man-made catastrophes and how those will be affecting the environment. And how those are interacting with climate change and making the consequences of such catastrophes maybe even worse. So yeah, my presentation will focus entirely on their consequences for the nature. And so if you look at the slide and on the photo on the left, you see a map of Ukraine. Well, you see a map of the world in the top left corner. The black dot shows where Ukraine is in Europe. It's somewhere around Central Europe. Then if you look at the picture again, you see a black square that shows a part of southern Ukraine. And this arrow indicates where the dam is in that part of Ukraine. And you can see how it looked before Russia exploded it on the June of 6, 2023. So Kakhovka Dam one of the biggest water reservoirs in Ukraine that occupied nearly 2,155 square kilometers. It was also it's in the first place in terms of water volume. It was built during Soviet times and its reservoir was used to cooling of nearby Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant reactor, and also importantly, it was used to for the irrigation purposes in southern Ukraine. So on the 6th of June, as Nastya mentioned, Russia blew up the Kakhovka Dam, and all the water from reservoir flooded the nearby areas. The destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine has not only resulted in a massive flood and a humanitarian crisis, but it has also unleashed a series of severe environmental consequences that are actually of great concern. The area of the flooding is estimated to be 5,000 square kilometers. And many of these environmental consequences are actually to be studied. Here are a few photos of how the flooding looked the first days after the explosion. And it was pretty dramatic and tragic. The breach of this crucial dam has disrupted the ecological balance of the area, leading to contamination, habitat destruction, and long-term consequences for the region's natural resources. So a lot of the consequences for the natural environment that I will be presenting now are coming from Ukrainian Nature Conservation Group and Ukrainian scientists who are trying to collect data on the impacts of the flooding and land drying on natural systems. So I'm summarizing what they've been talking up until now. I will also talk what kind of research questions they're asking, what they're investigating, and how critical is this dam explosion for the environment. There are two big blocks that I would like to talk about, and that have major consequences for their organism, the environment in Ukraine. And that the first one is land flooding. And probably the obvious one, we all saw the huge areas flooded after the explosion. And what this land flooding actually cost. So first, I would like to talk about is the negative impacts on terrestrial fauna and flora, and I'm talking about plants, mammals, birds, and small organisms such as insects, which also play important functions in our environment, while we are not really talking about them so much, maybe in everyday life. So, and a lot of red-listed birds, the endangered one, and mammals, they were immediately affected by the flood. They basically drowned in it. Up until now, we don't know the exact numbers of each species group that was affected, but we know that the effects are huge. Imagine that the amount of water that immediately covered those lands. There are also a lot of negative impacts on nesting birds. Many of them are endangered species. Endangered species in this area. And these are actually tens of thousands of individuals of different bird species. It's in the floodplains of the lower Dnipro river that the largest colonies of such birds as herons and other colonial birds have their nesting sites. And it should be noted that the catastrophic impact on the nesting of birds during nesting period is particularly important, because there will be no time for birds to have one more brood or have more offsprings. Some birds will lose their nesting colonies, and scientists estimate that it will take up to 7 years to restore those numbers, but we don't know exactly how long it will take. It's for scientists to still research and figure that out. And of course, flooding caused not only the problems for the Dnieper River, that the levels of Dnieper River rose, but also the levels of the nearby rivers that connected to the Dnieper, such as Ingulets. Those rivers were also affected, and the waters from the reservoir, Dnieper River, and the Rose and the other smaller rivers, they mixed, meaning that this mix of water would definitely destruct the local ecosystems of those rivers, and we don't know yet what the impact of that mixing will be. But there is other aspect that I also want to talk about is land drying. And it's more obvious now than it was in the first days of the explosion of the dam. And here it's very tragic, but one of the major impacts of this drainage of the land is impacts on the fish populations. A lot of fish species basically disappeared because they were living in the reservoir. The water from the reservoir left, and where kind of Ukraine losing vast fish stocks. So it's estimated that Kakhovka Reservoir was home to nearly 43 fish species, and 20 had commercial importance. And it will take minimum 7 to 10 years to restore such stocks, maybe more, still a question that we have to answer. I'm again talking about birds because, as I said, Kakhovka Reservoir had a few islands on which birds were nesting. Those islands were isolated from the mainland, so none of the predators that usually attack those birds were able to reach these bird colonies. Now, when the land is completely dried out, it's connected to the mainland. So besides the effects of flooding, birds population also strengthened by increased number of predators in those areas, those animals, for example, that will attack nesting colonies of birds and birds themselves. And also a large number of organisms inhabiting water body zone, right? They're living in the water, and within a few hours, this organism, or this zone where many organisms are inhabiting, where there is a lot of light, and many organisms, marine or freshwater organisms living on the surface of the rivers, they were exposed to the flooding. And it led to the death of the majority of benthic organisms in the reservoir. Oh, sorry, not flooding, but drying. Together with information about the loss of fish population, it can be concluded that the vast majority of all living organisms that inhabited the Kakhovka Reservoir have already perished and will perish in the coming months. And that includes, as we talked, different fish species, birds, but it also freshwater organisms such as mollusks, and also organisms that, or creatures that were feeding on them, again, birds, amphibians, and others. Although some may perceive these impacts are relatively insignificant compared to what people had to experience, all the tragedies, I think it's still crucial to recognize that these mammals and insects and birds are an integral part of the ecosystem, fulfilling important roles and occupying specific niches. And the potential extinction of these species would result in disruption of the local ecosystem and have consequences for human population, which we are yet to investigate. And besides the immediate consequences for the local environment, all the water from the Kakhovka Reservoir after the dam was exploded or blew up by Russians, it went basically straight to the Black Sea because it's connected it by many rivers. So on the figure to the right, you can see the satellite image of the Kakhovka Dam and Black Sea before their dam explosion, and on the image below you can see the vast area that was flooded, and that it's a lot of this water went straight to the Black Sea. So there are several impacts that I want to talk about for the Black Sea, and one of them is, which is considered a minor impact by scientists, is desalination of the sea. So all the fresh water, it mixed with the sea or salty water of the sea, and it of course may temporarily desalinate certain areas of the Black Sea. It's unclear yet how long, if these consequences for their marine environment are long-term or short-term, but several marine scientists of Ukraine speculate that those are minor effects. But one of the major effects is, of course, the pollution of the Black Sea. So the water that from the reservoir, it carried with it the sediments that were at the bottom of the reservoir. for the past 70 years. There are also several factories around the reservoir that were releasing heavy metals into the reservoir, and they were piling up at the bottom of the reservoir. So all this, together with fuel, gas, and other toxic substances, ended up in the water that went straight to the Black Sea. So you can imagine the consequences for the marine environment, but also for the people who use the Black Sea for recreational purposes. So what is happening to the Black Sea now? Are the projected consequences great in magnitude that we anticipated? And many Ukrainian scientists talking about agree that they're much worse than we thought. So if you look at the satellite image below, you could see how all this polluted substances or polluted water with organic matter and toxic substances spread into the Black Sea, and the border, the red border, actually shows the water, how quickly it spread into the Black Sea. Then this border is increasing, the more water reaching the Black Sea just in a day on June 9. And on the 10th of June, it's already covering much bigger area. So what about now? So scientists from Ukrainian Scientific Center for Ecology of the Sea, they're monitoring very closely the pollution of the Black Sea in basically real time. They established many sampling sites where they take samples of the water from different parts of the Black Sea, but including the reservoir, and monitoring pollution of the water, but also how it will affect the marine environment. So, for example, taking samples of the microorganisms and benthos that are in the water, and seeing whether the populations of those organisms are decreasing in response to such huge pollution. So on the 15th of June, you can see that the pollution has reached almost the coastal zone of Romania. And so the impacts of the dam explosion have far-reaching consequences also for the nearby countries and countries that are on the coast of or sharing the coast of the Black Sea. Yes. So I will also talk a little bit about the consequences for agriculture and if climate change can worsen them. It's a bit an open question, but most of us agree that the drying of the canals that were used for farm irrigation in the southern of Ukraine, they definitely will have huge devastating consequences for agriculture in Ukraine, but also, given that the climate warming is putting additional pressure on agriculture in the world, we assume that those effects will be even worse. So here are a few photos showing how the drying of the canals, irrigation canals that were used for agriculture, and most of them are now disconnected from the water, so there is almost no means of irrigating those lands. So Ukrainian government estimates indicate that the reservoir was blown up by Russian supplied water to more than 12,000 kilometers of canals, and canal-based irrigation is heavily relied upon in Ukraine in the summer, and the projected summer rains are unlikely to be sufficient to sustain crop health and average yields in the previously irrigated lands in the part of this country. So we expect that a lot of yield crops that we will lose a lot of yield this year, but we still have to estimate how much it will be. And I would like to finish it with another aspect is the international environmental law and what it says about environmental damage, and can we hold Russia accountable for it? So, so there are currently 4 core international crimes in the international criminal court's Rome statute. One of them is genocide. The other one is war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. And several lawmakers already agree that Russian aggression against Ukraine have a sign of genocidal aspect, but it also committed nearly 70,000 war crimes in Ukraine that are yet to be investigated, and you can imagine it will take years. But there is also one international war crime that we're talking much less about, is the genocide. And it's not yet part of their International Crime Court's Rome Statute, but maybe it's the time to discuss and include it into the list. So ecocide is unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. And that's definitely what Russia is doing intentionally in Ukraine. To be able to have Russia accountable for that, maybe it also would be a nice moment to include ecocide as one in the international crimes, because at this moment there are very little mechanism that would allow to hold Russia accountable for the crimes against the environment. With that, I would like to finish my presentation and say thank you for listening. I would be happy to answer any of your questions. Yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Maria. It is truly devastating to even think about the environmental consequences of the Kakhovka Dam explosion, and we know that we will be facing these consequences for years to come. So now let's turn to Natalia Laws, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Jordan Center. Natalia specializes in political economy, consumer society, gender, and the history of the social sciences and environmental history in the Soviet Union. She currently works on a book manuscript originally titled A Soviet Consumer Republic, Economic Citizenship and the Economy of Waste in the post-World War II Soviet Union. So this project departs from the standard economy of shortages narrative and offers a different dimension, an economy of waste, to describe Soviet consumption. It argues that after World War II, and especially with the onset of Cold War competition with the West, in addition to periodic shortages, the Soviet state regularly confronted a new challenge: cluttered markets, overproducing factories, and the excess commodities. Unlike shortages that were often vindicated by the official Bolshevik ideology as the people's sacrifice on the road to the country's industrialization and economic growth, excess and waste were endemic to the malfunction of a common economy, but far more difficult for authorities to explain and justify. By focusing on the emergence of socialist market research and consumer studies, the book explores how the economy of waste reshaped relationships between the state and its citizens. Natalia Laws received her PhD in history from Brandeis University in 2022. Her doctoral dissertation was supported by a Harriman Institute Carnegie Research Grant and a Mellon Dissertation Competition Fellowship from Brandeis, among others. As a Soviet historian, Natalia will help us put in the Kakhovka Dam explosion into historical perspective and what kind of conclusions we can draw for today's situation. Thank you very much, Natalia, for being here today.
Thank you so much, Nastya, for organizing this panel, the Jordan Center for hosting it, and all of you for joining us today. So I'm going to share my screen as well, and I want to start this presentation with what actually Maria was talking about when she was finishing her presentation. And it's actually a bit accidental, so we didn't plan to raise this topic, but actually it kind of shows how really important it is to think about terms that we're using when we're talking about this event. And here I would also kind of extend a little bit to what Maria said, because Currently, it's actually, we can't qualify the Kakhovka Dam destruction as a war crime. Because so there is like, according to the International Criminal Court and to the Rome Statute, so there is an article that protects the environment in case of war. And it is one of the war crimes that are kind of recognized in, by international law. And on this slide, we actually saw that you can see that there is actually like a very high kind of bar to qualify, to recognize like certain event as a war crime against the environment. So it should be widespread, long-term, and like severe damage. The persons that committed this crime, that it should kind of intend this act and actually know, like to have a full knowledge about the anticipated results of this crime. And the damage should be clearly excessive to the military advantage gained. So in other words, it's kind of like very kind of like quite kind of difficult to meet for most of the acts during the war. But I think the Kakhovka Dam destruction actually would qualify for this definition. But it's also kind of like important to see that like even if it qualifies, it's going to be only individual criminal responsibility. So there's like no state responsibility currently under the Rome Statute for this crime. But I want to kind of emphasize like how important to call this crime not just a war crime, but as an ecocide. And as Maria said, so ecocide currently is not recognized as an international crime, so just only like for international crimes. But the term itself was introduced in the 1970s, and actual legal activists, so they like advocating like actively for including ecocide as the fifth international crime. And what is important, so the argument is that the environment should be protected not only in times of war, but also in times of peace. So when we call this this event ecocide, so it's like important that kind of to understand that legal activism that is like behind this term, and that like this Ukrainian case actually like activists hope like would contribute to like wide recognition of this, and like would contribute to the recognition of ecocide as international crime. But in my presentation today, I'm going to focus a little bit on historical background of the Kakhovka project, and it's actually what was the key factor for the Soviet authorities who imagined and created the Kakhovka complex after the Second World War. So here, that was done according to the so-called Stalinist Plan for the Transformation of Nature that was approved in 1948 after the Second World War. And the idea was that like the Soviet state thought that like it's able to kind of manage the environment according to its like modernizing the needs of the modernizing state. And in case of the southern Ukraine, so what they focused basically, it was kind of changing two types of ecosystems. So the first was the steppes, and for the it's like I included two pictures like to give you some idea how kind of the steppe environment looks like in Ukraine. And so for the Soviet authorities, so the steppes constituted like a challenge because it has like high temperatures, like unstable low precipitation, often droughts, dry winds, and it basically soil is fertile but arid. So this lack of water was perceived as the main challenge to productive agriculture in this region. And another ecosystem that influenced the Soviets' decision about the Kakhovka project was the wetlands. So the wetlands in southern Ukraine, particularly on the Dnieper River, so it's like we now know like how like rich this ecosystem is in terms of biodiversity and you know, like the amphibian landscapes with, you know, aquatic and terrestrial animals, plants, you know, like birds. But for the Soviet authorities, it was actually waste. It was the wastelands. So they were considered as like breeding grounds for mosquitoes and diseases. There was like no agricultural value in those wetlands. And it was absolutely unproductive for agriculture. So the wetlands often, like for the kind of in the Soviet discourse, like even in the scientific one, was often kind of described as a wasteland. So basically, the Kakhovka project was imagined as taming those two types of ecosystems, and here water, and particularly water for irrigated agriculture, was like a key factor, a decisive factor to start and complete this project. So here is a map how, like in 1950, when this project, the whole project was approved, so how it looked, or how kind of the authorities imagined this rich like agriculture that is going to appear in this region in southern Ukraine. And you can see that, for example, here wheat was important, but actually, like the main crops that they imagined, it was cotton. And here you probably can see, you know, like cotton plants like here and there. And actually, the Ministry of the Cotton Growing of the USSR was one of the main stakeholders in this project. So the project was, let me kind of show you another map. So the project was basically consisted of several elements, and the Kakhovka Dam was just like one of them. So dam itself, which we can kind of see on this map. There is also the hydroelectric power station as part of this dam. Also, like the creation of the Kakhovka Sea or water reservoir was actually like the key element of this project to develop this irrigated agriculture. And also two canals that were imagined from the beginning to exist. So one is actually a canal like what we currently have is the North Crimean Canal, which is right here. But also the constructors imagined that would be another, the South Ukrainian Canal, which has never been built actually, but it was like on this map, you actually can see some of the kind of elements of this canal that was planned. And here is just, you know, a map, a little bit outdated because we still have Dnipro-Dzerzhinsk, which is currently Kamyansk. But actually, so we can see here that the Kakhovka Sea was like a part of like a kind of a cascade of water reservoirs on the Dnieper River. And all of them were built during the Soviet times, starting from Zaporizhia reservoir in 1927, and the rest of them until like when it finished until the 1970s. So the last part of my presentation is basically about some of the consequences of the Kakhovka project in the Soviet times, and particularly what it meant to create this vast water reservoir. And it's, first of all, it's actually like resettlement of people who lived at that time in that region that was going to be flooded. And it was like estimated that approximately like 37,000 people were resettled, and like at least 75 settlements were destroyed. So the Ukrainian filmmaker Alexander Dovzhenko, so he visited this project numerous times, and he talked with people who had to leave their villages. And so he wrote a screenplay in which, after his death, his wife Yulia Solntseva directed, which is called Poem of the Sea. And here you see some scenes from the film, how villagers experienced this destruction. So we have, excavators who actually kind of demolished all of these settlements. And this man, for example, so he asks to he asks to close his eyes because he can't see his house to be destroyed. Some of the other consequences of the creation of the Kakhovka water reservoir was actually also like the destruction of the Ukrainian historical legacy, which basically, so on this map, you see the reconstruction of so-called the Great Meadow. This was like the wetlands after the Dnipro Rapids. And it was basically the main kind of historical place for Zaporizhia Cossacks in Ukraine, and particularly all of their like strongholds, Sichi, were built in this region. And so they also like benefited from the wetlands, from the Great Meadow kind of ecosystem. So they relied on like supply of fish and kind of other means for this. So all of this territory, which you actually can recognize a little bit from, from the Kakhovka Sea, from the maps where you can see the Kakhovka Sea. So actually all of these wetlands were flooded. And so the last but not the least consequence, the destruction of the wetlands. It was a huge environmental. It has a huge environmental damage. But I'm talking about this last not because it's the least important, but actually because we know very little about this. So it's so the Soviet authorities and also the Soviet scholars, like most of them, like didn't value the biodiversity of the wetlands. So there was actually little study how they look like in terms of the ecology before the destruction, and how actually what happened, like what environmental consequences were when the Kakhovka Dam and reservoir were created. So it's kind of still like we still need this very like painstaking environmental historical research to understand like the scope of this tragedy for the environment in the 1950s. So, and I kind of finish my presentation with like also like reiterating the ideas that other participants already mentioned, that at least if we rely on that Soviet legacy, water and water management is really a key of how to have to think about long-term consequences for the dam destruction now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's the topic that is not very often spoken about, that the construction of the dam had historical consequences for the ecosystem of Ukraine and for its residents. It's a tragedy for Ukrainians today, but it was a tragedy for Ukrainians at the time when it was constructed. So we have to take into consideration dozens of years, decades really, of this environmental abuse that Ukrainians, local residents, have been experiencing through all these years. So thank you very much, Natalia. That was extremely interesting. So now let's turn to Olga Voroshpit, a Ukrainian journalist and researcher. Currently, she works as a deputy editor-in-chief of Ukrainski Tиждень, a Ukrainian online media publication. Since 2013, Olga has worked as a journalist and an observer in various Ukrainian and European mass media. In 2014, she worked with the German ARD channel as a local producer, focusing on the MH17 plane crash investigation. In 2014-2021, she worked as a foreign desk observer for the Ukrainian weekly Tyzhden. For over a decade, Olga worked with the East European Development Institute, a non-governmental organization in Ukraine, where her research focused on post-coloniality and the development of South Asian countries. Since 2018, she has served as an affiliated expert with the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian PRISM, a network-based non-governmental analytical center where her research focuses on Ukrainian relations with the countries of South Asia. Olga graduated from the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in 2013 with an MA in European and German Studies. She is currently pursuing her PhD degree at Ivan Franko National University of Lviv. Olga is the only one amongst us who currently lives in Ukraine on a permanent basis. So she witnessed the societal response firsthand, and we will be able to share with us her thoughts on what kind of impact Kakhovka Dam explosion had on the Ukrainian society and on economic consequences in Ukraine. Thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Just a moment.
So while we are waiting for Olga to join, I would like to remind our audience members that they can add their questions in the chat in Zoom, or they can raise their hand and ask their questions in Zoom when we have discussion section of our panel. Okay, so since we have a little break, we already have one question in the chat, and this is a question to Maria. So I will just read it, and we will start this little intermission before Olga presents. This is a question to Maria. I was wondering, in your opinion, what the potential impacts of these heavy metals and or agricultural waste products that were likely spread into the surrounding watershed, soils, and overall environment could have on future and long-term agricultural production, as well as potential impacts on the health of local residents outside of the obvious impacts of flooding. I know a lot of information is preliminary and the data collection is still difficult.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Jacob. So actually, a lot of plants, including crops, they do need some of the heavy metals such as zinc and magnesium and ferrum for their growth and well-being. But the excessive amounts of such heavy metals that were transmitted with the floods into the soil of the flooded regions, they would definitely be toxic for most of the crops in the long term. And some of these heavy metals, such as arsenic, if I'm not mistaken, they're also bad for human health. I mean, they're very high concentrations. They can have some cancerogenic effects. I'm not 100% sure, but that's what I remember from my biology studies. So that's yet one another things that we'll have to monitor. It's the toxicity of the crops that we're using in our daily lives. Yeah, and for human health, from human health perspective, it's always very hard to show the connection between the worse human health and the concentration of those heavy metals. But obviously, if in the 5 or 10 years, we'll see that a large part of Ukrainian population is experiencing some health issues that probably would relate to the exposure of the heavy metals, including in our agricultural products.
Thank you so much, Maria, for your answer. Olga is back, so we will proceed with Olga's presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nastya, for your presentation and for inviting me. I will not have the special presentation, but what I would like to share are mainly the societal consequences of the Kakhovka Dam explosion, and also some economical consequences that we face here in Ukraine. As Nastya already as Nastya already said, I'm a journalist mainly working in Ukraine. And what I see, and I would like to share mainly my more personal experiences of the Kakhovka Dam explosion. So as already it was presented, Russian forces blew up the dam of the Kakhovka reservoir at 2 a.m. on the 6th of June. After that, an artificial sea poured into the Dnieper riverbed and flooded villages and towns below the town of Nova Kakhovka. About 80 settlements in the Kherson and Mykolaiv region were submerged. According to the police, at least 31 people went missing in the government-controlled area, including 7 children, and 16 people were killed. The number of casualties on the occupied left bank of the Dnieper River is unknown, but it is definitely higher. Recalling the first days after the blowing up of the Kakhovka Dam, I'm recalling messages of my friends who still have relatives on the occupied territories, and mostly these were older people who could not evacuate themselves. And the most heartbreaking messages were that people could not get to the roof, so that to stay over the period when the water was coming to their villages. And frankly, for many Ukrainians, 6th of June was something equivalent to the 24th of February 2022, meaning that, yes, already in 2022, Russia has already started the war against Ukraine, because it was going on since 2014. But at the same time, so till the 6th of June of 2023, we already had over more than a year of the full-scale war. But at the same time, conducting the crime of such a level was frankly something unexpected, or even unimaginable. Not unexpected, because it seems that people now expect everything, but was unimaginable. But now we see it, and we can evaluate the level of the crime. So Ukraine Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba called the explosion of Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant the largest man-made disaster of the last decade. It caused enormous environmental and humanitarian damage to the Ukrainian South. Maria, Natalia, and Anastasia have already talked about them. So the levels of water over the period of 3 weeks that passed since the explosion now went down, and some of people are returning to their houses. So there's enormous sums of money will be needed to rebuild the houses or to build the new ones. But there is the huge problem, which I would like to highlight. It's more economical one. So southern Ukraine is important as world breadbasket, and that's the world's breadbasket, and that's not an exaggeration. So Dnipro and Zaporizhia are some of the most important regions for wheat. Dnipro is also important for sunflower seeds. And for example, before the full-scale invasion, Ukraine, so India imported almost 100% of its sunflower oil from Ukraine. Odessa and Mykolaiv have the biggest yields for barley. These regions, so a series of canals that run from Kakhovka Reservoir, they help to irrigate these regions of southern Ukraine. What I would like also to stress that Ukraine exported, so the biggest importers of grain from Ukraine are China, Spain, Turkey, Italy, Egypt, Bangladesh. So now with the situation we face now, the levels of grain that Ukraine can export will of course be lower. what I would like also, and here I would like to show you how this will impact also the farmers of the region. Just a moment. So here you can see the high-capacity transshipment terminal, which was opened in Mariansky village, Dnipropetrovsk region in 2020. So this is one of the objects of the company called Nibulon. It is one of the greatest companies that shipped grain from Ukraine all over the years, and it developed river shipping. So the shipping of grain from Ukraine through the rivers and then through the Black Sea. So this was what its owner and founder Oleksiy Vadotursky was doing. And interestingly, Russia, with a missile, they killed Vadotursky last year in Mykolaiv, in his flat in Mykolaiv. And this is how this terminal looked in 2020, just built. And this is how it looks now. So my colleague Stas Kozluk, he visited this terminal, and so the water here was on the level of 4 to 5 meters, and some like ships could come and take the grain from the terminals. Now there is no water, and this is the case for many farmers who use this water to irrigate, and in this case also to transport their products. To transport their products from that region. So, the farmers suffered already before the Kakhovka Dam explosion, because of course they face the huge. So the first issue was an impossibility to export grain from Ukraine. Then we have this grain corridor, but also you should understand that even having the grain corridor, and Russia, which says yes, we allow Ukraine can export its grain through grain corridor, but then we have lots of inspections there, which make the limits and barriers so that this grain could not be transported. So, like, we can have. So there is allowance, but at the same time there are barriers so that grain cannot be exported. The other issue is since the start of full-scale invasion, Ukrainian farmers so the land is mined, and they are using sometimes themselves. They are demining the territories, and this causes that they are even killed, but during the process of demining, just because this the issue, the possibility to plant grain is so important for them. So with Kakhovka Dam explosion, we have these processes that were earlier even worsened. So the situation in which Ukrainian farmers are now is just devastating, and this is what I would like to highlight in this my presentation. But at the same time, I think that Ukrainians would not be Ukrainians if they would not look for some solutions. And I know that there are that at the moment people in Odessa region have found the possibility to irrigate more territory, so that more territories could be used for planting fruits and vegetables. Because when we speak about southern Ukraine, it was important not only for like grains, for wheat, barley, etc., but also it was very important as a place where most of Ukrainian vegetables was growing on. So I remember how we were going on to the southern Ukraine, coming back with peppers, tomatoes, and they are the best there. And of course, last year after Kherson was liberated, many were coming there with a watermelon. So you understand that this is the region where we have and we plant those fruits and vegetables, and therefore they are important. Now, the farmers there, as well as Ukrainians, do not have this opportunity. And what does it mean? It means the higher prices for Ukrainians. It means impossibility to work for farmers. And it also influences the situation with food security in the countries of global South, because if we speak not about the fruits and vegetables, but about the grain, it was what was mainly what Ukraine exports there, and what supports the food security issue in the region. What we do here, and I hope we will have, we have discussions already, like on the level of, I see in the media publications, that what can be done so that to irrigate the regions after the war. So should we renovate Kakhovka Dam, or should we found some solutions to irrigate the region and leave it as it was, as Natalia said, this it was historically and previously. So I think this would be the discussion of how to rebuild the region and how to reconstruct the territory. But at the same time, and especially now, the main issue is, of course, the food security and the possibility for farmers to produce and to do what they love and what they need, frankly, for their living. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olga, for making it so down to earth for all of us, for realizing the human cost of what has happened. And you already partially answered this question, but I still think that we can kick off our Q&A section by questions from the chat. And I highly encourage everyone to raise your hands and to participate. So since Olga kind of mentioned it, we'll start with this question. This is a question by Catherine Young. Given the tragedy of the dam's construction in both human and environmental terms, can its destruction offer opportunities to repair that earlier environmental damage? Or has the damage just been compounded? In other words, should the dam be rebuilt or not? And if not, if there is strong enough support in Ukraine to withstand any pressure to rebuild? I think this is the question to all of our panelists, so just go in the order you prefer.
Well, I can start to add my understanding and kind of to emphasize what's probably I didn't say in my presentation. So it took decades to kind of to adjust both economically and environmentally and socially to what happened in the 1950s. So it wasn't it wasn't like one-time solution during like a short period of 1 or 2 years, and then you have this brand new good world of irrigated agriculture in southern Ukraine. So it was actually took decades, and whatever solution we're talking right now, I think it was also we have to think about kind of long-term consequences, but also think about that it's going to be a long-term project. So it's probably, especially in terms of environmental consequences, it's going to take years and decades to kind of whatever decision we will take, in terms of kind of reconstruction. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maria, do you have an opinion on whether it should or should not be rebuilt?
No, I can't say that I have an opinion. I probably lean in that it shouldn't be rebuilt, but I definitely don't have a good alternative to that. I'm sure there are maybe modern methods and how we can irrigate the land and not bring so much destruction to the environment. I would guess Ukraine will have to open the discussion with the world, invite, or we definitely have a lot of specialists in Ukraine and scientists working that we can invite to open the discussion on what's the best way to proceed. I just can't think that building a new dam would be a solution.
Nastya.
Olga?
Yeah. Yeah, I will then continue what I was talking about. So why I started about talking about that is just because what I see, we have this discussion already. I mean, mainly on the level of media and media, which asks experts to comment. And of course, we have different opinions at the moment, and I think that this discussion should continue with different opinions and different thoughts, and then we will find the solution. Because, well, frankly, at the moment, taking into consideration that this is so close to the front line, until the moment Ukraine liberates all its territory, I think it will not be possible to make this solution like working. I mean, so at the moment we can only talk how we can do this, but the main issue which I think we have to take into consideration is the irrigation of the region, because this is how this region lives and how these people who live there live. So they make for living with producing and growing these vegetables, wheat and so on. So this is from this perspective, I think we have to think about, and also from the perspective, what will be less harmful for ecology and the environment, taking into consideration that over less than 100 years, it had such a huge consequences of man-made catastrophes. Yes, thank you.
I also quickly add that we are facing climate change and climate warming, and the consequences of it will be greater and greater in the coming up to 50 years, depending on what scenario we're choosing to go. So I believe like all the new methods that we'll use, or new mechanisms how we'll irrigate the land, they should be sustainable. And maybe it's something that scientists and engineers would have to invent, like maybe new methods. So it's like, yeah, but as Olga said, while the war is still on, until Ukraine wins, we have to be, we can't do much, but we have to be prepared and have a solution in mind when the war is over and Ukraine wins.
Yeah, thank you so much. I once heard that Kakhovka Reservoir contains enough water for the whole population of the Earth for 4 years to drink. You know, that I'm not sure how accurate the statistic is, but you know, there was a ton of water. We have to remember that. Jim has been patiently waiting for quite a while, so please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for your very rich presentations. I want to ask two questions. First of all, why do you think the Russians blew it up? Is it simply their perception of a short-term military gain? And secondly, how does it affect the water issue on the nuclear plant that's on the southern side of the reservoir? I know that there's been concern about the cooling pool there, and supposedly the Russians say that they have enough water to cool it, but I just wondered what your assessment is of that.
Thank you so much. I assume this is a question to all participants as well. So whoever has the answer ready, please go ahead.
Well, I can drive it. I'm not a military expert, but I know that there are military strategies that were used already by the Soviet army, that they blew up the dam so that to stop the army that is countering them. So this is the military strategy, and taking into consideration that Ukrainian counteroffensive this was the period when it was developing and almost already starting. I think this was the issue why they decided to use this military strategy. But once more, like, I'm not a military expert. I just know that it is used, and it was used by the Red Army, and I think that Russians are doing the same. Concerning that's thing, I think I will stop on that.
Well, I can just add to this discussion, like to address one of the counter arguments that are, people who still doubt who did it. So people often say, well, like with the Kakhovka Dam destruction, it's actually like the North Crimean Canal was also kind of dried, and like there's like no water for Crimea, so there's like no reason for the Russians to do it. So kind of we have to remember that Crimea also has its own water reservoirs. And a few days ago, at least, officially those like Russian occupying authorities in Crimea kind of said that so their water reservoirs are full and it's enough water for them like for 2 years to sustain themselves like without water from the North Crimean Canal. So basically kind of if you kind of imagine this kind of kind of strategies that like you still have this like for Russians this like 2 year time to kind of to keep what they already have and just potentially to rebuild it. So there is like no immediate danger for Crimea. So which means that it's a factor that they kind of like thought about, but it's also not a factor, like not kind of a counter factor to say that, well, Russians couldn't do it. So they were definitely prepared for the consequences for them. Thank you.
I just want to say that I could see that they had both military and environmental like the consequences in mind when they blew up, because it seems like their strategy to leave Ukrainian land infertile, and maybe part of the genocidal strategy that you preclude people from living on the lands or living everything that is not sustainable or like suitable for agriculture or anything after they retreat. So I could see that they have both of those consequences in mind when they blew it up. As for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, I mean, I don't think we know that well what's actually happening there. I know that there, of course, this international community and International Atomic Energy Agency that are visiting the plant, but we don't really know what Russians are showing them, where they're allowed to enter. So it's very hard to know. We know from the Ukrainian government that many reactors and the cooling reservoir is being mined or was mined by Russians. Yeah, what would that mean in the coming months? Will they like how to say? Will they blow it up? And yeah. It's still an open question, but it's something that the international community has to put a lot of attention to, because the explosion of the dam and the flooding caused a lot of environmental damage, but the radiation from the nuclear power plant, that will be even maybe worse or have even worse consequences for the Europe, definitely.
If I may, I would add up just one thing concerning the Ukrainian government. President Zelensky warned for the first time that Russians mined the dam last autumn. And just a week ago, or even a few days ago, President Zelensky warned that Russians preparing a terrorist act on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So these warnings, I think that I am taking them into consideration because I live in Ukraine, but I think that people should take them into consideration. What will be the consequences? It's of course the difficult question, taken into consideration, as far as I heard from like commentaries, that the NPP is not like working fully. That's why I think we can't predict the consequences. But the issue that the Ukrainian government warns, I think we should take this into consideration and as an international community somehow to influence the situation, as I hope we still can do this.
Thank you so much. So before I proceed to my questions, I want just to double check that there are no additional questions from the audience. So if you want to speak now.
Do we have another question from Jim, or Jim, is your hand still raised from the previous question?
Yes, I just wanted to ask a quick follow-up.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Thank you. And yes, President Zelensky made that comment on Thursday last week, the day before the coup began, about the warning of the plant. Just two things to throw in the mix. I've been helping the networks deal with the situation for the past 2 years. And we noticed that what the Russians did after they blew up the dam, even though it flooded their defenses on the southern side of the Dnieper, was that they shifted troops that were in reserve facing the Ukrainian forces and moved them further eastwards to deal with the fighting that's been breaking out since June 4th. The other question, though, was I sort of felt like they did this to deliberately hit the Ukrainian economy by disrupting the agricultural production and ability to export. And I'm just the last thing I just wondered is if any of you had a concrete estimate as to how much it actually has knocked out, and if that did, is it 20 or 30%? I've seen statistics all over the place about how much it's actually hurt the production of this very rich area that was irrigated by the reservoir. I just wondered if any of you have any ideas to the actual magnitude of this, aside from the very powerful comments that you've all made.
I will try to answer.
I can just start a little bit. So I didn't see any statistics, any recent kind of statistics. So maybe other participants have better idea about this, but I saw some research that basically the Ukrainian farmers, so at some point in the 1990s, so it seems that they didn't use much that irrigational canals because they were basically very old, that is also kind of this, scrap, metal scrapping with people just, kind of collected it for money, but in 2000s it's actually we have kind of increasing trends of Ukrainian farmers relying on that on those canals, which means that that's at least a very serious issue. So it's because I also kind of saw some comments that while those canals were not really important because people used kind of wells that they kind of dug and the artisan water, and that's actually kind of quite enough. But I think it makes sense for a kind of smaller scale, farms probably. But again, the statistics that I saw, it was 2014 or something, that their dependence on those irrigational canals was more and more prominent in Ukrainian agriculture.
While I was preparing for my presentation, I came across the numbers from the Center of Economic Strategy, Ukrainian. So what they say is that the catastrophe will cause the disruption of the irrigation system of fields in Dnipro, Kherson, and Zaporizhia region. And in 2021, these fields allowed us to gather crops for 1.5 billion US dollars. So this is the exact sum of how much does these crops cost Ukraine in 2021, which were gathered in the territories that were irrigated with water which came from reservoir.
So as we can see, for the for the agricultural production, the consequences have already been clearly devastating. And my question to the participants is actually, do you think these consequences go beyond the borders of Ukraine? Maria has already mentioned that the level of saline level has changed in the Black Sea, meaning that fisheries in Turkey, Bulgaria, Moldova will be affected as well? Is it my correct understanding? So I know that Ukraine won't be able to export, but what about production in other countries?
Yeah, so I can quickly answer. I think one of the major potential problems is the pollution of the Black Sea. It was already polluted for a bit, so but still, like the inflow of heavy metals will definitely disrupt the ecological system and the food webs. I mean, the fishes, the mantas that they eat, on mollusks, etc. And as we saw from satellite images, the pollution indeed it reaches some neighboring countries that share the coast of the Black Sea. So that potentially can have a effect. Yeah, maybe. But I mean, until we have scientific enough data to like model the consequences, I think it's really hard to say how it will disrupt, but it definitely will to some extent. The production and the production of fish, I would say, and
So I've seen some maps, and I've seen some maps, but that were projecting these consequences beyond the Black Sea basin and onto the Mediterranean. Is it even possible for this pollution to go from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean? Does it work this way?
Now I have to look at the map. Yeah, potentially from the rivers and etc. I don't know how long it will take the pollution to reach, but honestly, I don't have a good answer to that yet. I haven't seen those maps, but if you can share with me.
I'm sorry, I was just like thinking about the European Union in general, because a lot of people have criticized European leaders for inadequate response when compared to the scale of the ecological damage. Without too many details, what do you think, and that is a question to all of you, what do you think respond in the Ukrainian society would be a year from now? Do you think we should expect some migration from the regions and there will be no jobs? Or should we expect more refugees in the European Union and other countries, such as the United States, which still has the active United for Ukraine program for people coming from Ukraine? What kind of demographic outcomes should we expect?
I can only assume, but like taking into consideration Ukrainians and how it looked and how people were cooperating somehow to help each other during the first days and also now, I don't think that those people who stayed in Ukraine till now, also on the territories affected with this catastrophe, will move somewhere else. Of course, there will be less job, because there are people who were like not only like farmers, but who worked on these terminals, which I showed, and so on. But I do think that if some percentage leaves, it will be like through Ukraine. But at the same time, I assume that people will look for some solutions already on the ground, because as we see from the villages in Kherson region, people are coming back as when they can do this. I also, my colleague did an interview with a family who moved from their village and lived in a tent, waiting some period of time so that water went down, and then they moved back so that to rebuild their house, and they want to stay on their territory. So taking all these examples into consideration, I don't expect that there will be like more the bigger level of migration. Maybe some like internal migration through Ukraine, but not much. This is like my assumption as I see it now.
I just want to add to this, because I think like we kind of justly talk a lot about agriculture and farmers, but also again like relying and like thinking about the Ukrainian legacy, the Soviet legacy. So the problem was also that many plants and factories used that were built in the Soviet times. So they used water, relied on that water basically like as a free resource for their technical needs. So we didn't talk much about this during this panel, but it's also kind of like one of the factors that we have to think about. And like the Zaporizhia nuclear plant is like one of the like the best known examples, but it's not the only one. And so if those plants don't have access to this basically free water, so we have to think about like how to change that production cycle and the production to make it more sustainable. But also this is solutions that affects workers and their wages, and it's not only a problem demographically speaking, it's not only a problem for villages and farmers, but also for cities and for city dwellers. So we have to think about this as well.
Thank you so much. We still have a question for, we still have time for one final question. So if you were patiently waiting to ask that question, this is your time. If not, I will use the privilege of the host to wrap up this amazing panel. Thank you so much for agreeing to join this panel on such a short notice, for talking about such an important, salient and time-sensitive event, and the consequences of which we will be facing for years and years to come. I really hope that once the fall session resumes, we will be able to start gathering more often again and to discuss ongoing events in Ukraine as Ukrainian counteroffensive is developing and as we are looking into the winter months. Again, thank you all of you for joining us today, and thank you very much the Jordan Center for making it possible for us to talk about Kakhovka Dam explosion today.
Thank you, Nastya, for organizing this.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you and goodbye.